Well, good morning, and thank you, Lara. Thank you, Steve and Beth and Key Ministry and McLean Bible for hosting this gathering. And greetings, friends. What a joy it is to be in a room filled with people who are working to create communities where we can worship together and serve together and learn together and grow together in faith and in love and in life. Churches where believing and belonging abound together for every member of the body. No asterisks, no exceptions. We're called to share that assurance with every person that they are beloved and that they belong to God, and then to nurture communities where we each can belong to one another. So I'm just so grateful for your willingness to be part of this gathering, to move our communities from exclusion to embrace, and to do that for every family that experiences disability. Well, the guiding passage for this year's conference comes from Colossians, a letter Paul wrote to a church he didn't start, one he never visited, but he prayed for and he encouraged their faithful work. And as Laura emphasized yesterday, know that we too are in constant prayer for you and for your work, that you would be wise and faithful in your movements, that you'd be guided by the Spirit and attuned to God's wisdom and will, that your ministries would bear much fruit, as we talked about yesterday, as you follow the way of Jesus and you lean into the strength that he gives, and that joy would abound for you in this long haul work. And this is hard, long haul work. But we are thankful for the beautiful glimpses that God gives us of this inheritance ahead, one that's not earned through achievement or ability or even understanding, but it's this good and gracious gift from God. So thank you for the ways you're working to create communities of belonging for families who struggle so much to find one. So we're going to dive right in. Some of you know me. If you know me, you know I have a few peculiar hobbies. I've shared some of these with you before. I actually collect postcards from everywhere I travel. Not so unusual, except no one really sends postcards anymore. And I am obsessed with collecting national park pins everywhere I go. And DC is an incredible place to collect those. I have about 150 of those so far as well. And then I also collect church signs. At least photos of church signs. I know it's wrong to actually steal them. That seems inappropriate. All different denominations, all across the theological spectrum. Goodlettsville Church of Christ, as it says on the street, everyone invited. St. Timothy Lutheran, come worship with us, all are welcome. Signs that in various ways say something about who a church expects or hopes will arrive. Shellsford Baptist Church, everyone welcome. Signs that often make a proclamation about what people will experience when they enter on the inside. Like Park Church, you're welcome here. A warm welcome to all, come as you are, welcome to the Lord's house, everyone. This hobby is actually a source of great frustration for my family because I'm often making swerving U-turns at 70 miles per hour to catch a photo of a church that we've passed. Unsolicited advice, if you happen to have as your job responsibility your church's sign, spell check the church sign. It says O-B-A-Y, I think it's O-B-E-Y, I'm not sure, but I hope they're not attending today. Are you here? No, okay. But one of my long favorite signs in this collection comes from a church that's next door to the high school where my two oldest kids attended high school in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. And it references a passage that I'm sure you all know so well, and I'll read it to you. It says, read 1 Corinthians 12, we need you here ASAP. And I love this sign because it suggests a posture that I wish every church and every ministry would adopt as they think about a faith community filled with families, with friends, with disabled members and leaders who all experience disability. We need you here ASAP. We're incomplete without your presence, without your gifts, without your friendship, without your faith. And I know you all know that passage well. I love the paraphrase that comes from the Message that says, I think captures this so well. It says, the way God designed our bodies is a model for understanding our lives together as a church. Every part dependent on every other part. The parts we mention and the parts we don't. The parts we see and the parts we don't. If one part hurts, every other part is involved in the hurt and in the healing. And if one part flourishes, every other part enters into exuberance. We hurt together. We hope together. We flourish together. And so we need you here, ASAP. Every part, none less than the others. There's no asterisks or footnotes or unspoken qualifiers in that verse. And as Lamar often reminds us, there's no hierarchy of bodies and minds in the church. So what does it mean to honor those outside signs as we think about children and youth with disabilities in our midst? What are the postures and the practices that communicates to people with disabilities and their families that they're integral, that they're indispensable, that they're needed, that they're desired? What difference would it make for us to live out those outside signs, those signs of hospitality on the inside of our churches? And I'm not here today to answer these questions from my perspective, but instead to foreground the experiences and the insights of families who've been part of our recent research projects. Families who pass these church signs at 70 miles per hour like me and read them and wonder, does that include me as well? So as a researcher, I actually sometimes think of myself as a collector of stories as well, a careful collector. In our projects, we invite people with disabilities and their families to share their experiences in and hopes for the church, and they so generously share what's been most helpful, what's been most hard, what's been hurtful, what's been healing. And each story that we hear is personal, and it's precious. It's different from all the others. There's no two stories that are quite the same. There is no family church story. It's always stories. But as you listen long and prayerfully, you start to hear some common themes that weave across those church stories. And for our team at Baylor, who you'll hear from in a minute as well, the important work for us is to recognize the patterns in those stories and to share back what we learn in ways that we hope honor the experiences of families and that invite a faithful response from the church. And there are so many stories in our midst and in your midst. In fact, there's more than 7 million children and youth with disabilities who reside in cities and neighborhoods all across the country, including in your corner, all around the world. That's 1 in 6 young people under 18 have a disability that impacts their learning or relationships, or often impacts their opportunities and expectations and participation. Does your church serve more than 6 children? You're in the midst of disability and ministry. Which means then that there's more than 5 million families for whom disability is central to their story. That equates to about 1 in 3 households in the United States. Does your church serve more than 3 families? You're in the midst of thinking about disability and ministry. So what are we learning from those families who are part of our research at Baylor? We're just wrapping up a large-scale study, literally right as we speak, that involves parents of children with disabilities in Texas. More than 350 families have already participated, and this fall we'll have a full report ready for you all, but you're going to get a sneak peek at what we're learning right now. We invited diverse families who are currently or recently involved in a local church to complete in-depth surveys about their church experiences. This is important to keep in mind because these are parents who have been connected to a church, not the ones who've never, ever arrived in the first place. We also interviewed about 36 of those families. And this work is done in partnership with our wonderful collaborators at With Ministries as part of a Lilly Endowment grant called Nurturing Children in Worship and Prayer. And in my remaining time with you, I want to highlight what we're hearing by organizing our initial findings around 7 key themes. You should know there are many, many more themes, but since this is a church conference, I thought 7 felt a little bit more biblical or something. I'm not sure how that works. So you get 7. So let's get started. Theme 1, their faith matters immensely. For so many of these families, their faith is a central and salient part of their lives. It might help to imagine that you're in the midst of 100 families, parents of children with disabilities, which is what I'm putting in terms of icons up on the screen. That's actually probably close to true in the number of people in this room who are also family members and parents of kids with disabilities. I'm going to read out some statistics that I'm also going to place visually on the screen so you can watch the figures or you could hear what I share as well. Do not get lost in the specific numbers that I share or the figures I show. What I want you to notice is overall patterns and envision what they might mean for your ministries and your work in your local churches. 87% of parents say they look to their faith for providing meaning and purpose in their life. And there's two shades kind of a yellow that differentiate how strongly they agree with that. But very few parents disagree, which is shown in white. Faith matters to them. It provides meaning and purpose. And nearly the same proportion of parents say that their faith impacts so many of the decisions they make, not just on Sunday, but all 7 days of the week. It informs how they raise their children, how they steward their marriage, how they navigate their lives, how they cope with challenges. Faith impacts their decisions. And even more, they say that they enjoy being around others who share their faith. That's true of 91% of all of the parents. They love being part of a community that loves being around them. To be around other believers who love the Lord too, to be in community, to find belonging. And about 85% of parents say that prayer is an everyday part of their life. They pray for their children, for their families, for their communities, for the world. And as I'm going to show you in theme 6, these families are praying for you as well, for your churches in very hope-filled ways. The faith of families in our midst is such a deep source of encouragement and strength and support as they navigate the ordinary challenges and the often extraordinary challenges of raising a child with disabilities. What do you know about the faith the place of faith in the lives of the families that are in your midst? And the interesting thing is that the introduction of disability into the life of their family actually elevates the importance of their faith. Some people wonder whether a new diagnosis or an introduction of disability into the world turns people away from the church. It seems to be that the opposite is true. More than half of families said their faith became a lot more important because of having a child with disabilities, and another fifth said it was somewhat more important. Only about a fifth said it stayed the same, and almost no one said it decreased in importance, right? As disability enters into their story, faith matters all the more in the lives of these families. So ministry leaders, as these families start to lean into their faith, what's our response? Are we leaning back into these families? Theme 2, they long for a life of faith for their children with disabilities. One mother that we interviewed shared her hopes for her autistic son, saying, I know that God made him with purpose and that God loves him and that he belongs to God. But I want him to know that too. We heard so many variations of that same sentiment, a desire for their children to grow in faith and in their love of God, which brings us to the next set of statistics. We asked how important it was for these parents that their child be involved in church. Nearly every parent said it was important or very important. To worship together with others, to learn together with others, to serve together with others, and to belong together with others. And I love any time I see in our studies the number 99, and then there's 1. And it reminds me of a biblical story about what we do when we think about the 1. But more than mere inclusion, this is important. They want their children with disabilities to grow in their faith. Not just to be present, but to grow in their faith, to love and be held in the love of God, to learn who they are and whose they are, blessed, beloved, beautiful children of the King. 99% of parents said that is their hope. So ministry leaders, you are in the midst of families in your community who want to be in the midst of you. What are we doing to make sure that can happen? Which takes us to theme 3. Too many families are drifting from their churches. Too many families are drifting from their churches. This is where we start to see a splitting of stories, where they bend in one of two directions. When we ask families how their involvement in church changes because of having a child with disabilities, we were really encouraged to learn that about a fifth of families said their church involvement actually increased a little or a lot because of having a child with disabilities. The welcome widened, supports began to strengthen. And about a fifth of families, their involvement stayed the same. We can be glad for that too. They remained connected to a community that mattered to them. But you quickly realize that leaves 60% of families whose church stories are moving to the peripheries or the edges of community. Their involvement decreased a little or a lot. And this movement away from the middle and the center is actually more common than not. What do you imagine accounts for the difference between those whose involvement is increasing and those who's decreasing? And you should know this is not the same drift in involvement that we hear referenced in the reports about how many Americans are now leaving the church. Remember that the vast majority of families address the high importance of faith in their lives and noted that they want to be more involved in the life of their church, not less involved in their church. And in fact, when we asked how much involvement parents were hoping to have at their church, 2/3 of families say we want to become much more or somewhat more involved in the life of our church. Only about 1/3 said my involvement's just right, and almost no one wanted less. Families that desire to be part of the church, they want their children to grow, they want to be more part of the life of the church, they want the very same thing when asked about their hopes for their child's involvement. It was almost always a desire for more involvement, never for less involvement. Juxtapose those findings. I know that's a lot to kind of take in. Most church-going families of children and youth with disabilities want much more involvement, but they're experiencing much less. Is there any other segment of our local communities who, if they said they wanted to dive deeper into the life of our church, that we would look the other way? So ministry leaders, lean into these families that want to lean into you. Which takes us to the fourth theme of just how hard church can be for so many families. Much harder than it should be. We asked parents about how having a child with disabilities impacted their own involvement in church. Only about half of parents, 52%, said it's now much harder to be part of my church. Another third said it was somewhat harder. Only 9% said it doesn't really make a difference. And actually only one of the hundreds of parents we interviewed in this study said it's actually now easier. I would love to learn a little bit more about that. So many things can make church challenging. Barriers of awareness or attitude or architecture, acceptance or accessibility, barriers of our values or our priorities, our theologies. Sometimes it's just the limits of our imagination. And there's still so many barriers to inclusion and belonging in the church. Why does that matter so much? Because nearly half of families in our study that's happening right now shared that they've left a church in the past because their child with disabilities wasn't accepted or supported. 48%. That's a heartbreaking statistic. And sadly, it's quite a bit higher than 15 years ago when we did this study, when it was 1 in 3 families. Know that your church may well be the second or the third or the fifth or the 10th church a family has entered, with hopes that this time there won't be any asterisks or footnotes on those church signs. That all are welcome means them as well. That everybody is invited is written with them in mind as well. And our sanctuary should be places of sanctuary and rest and hope and healing for these families. Indeed, it should be for every family in our midst. We want to be communities that are known for our welcome and our support and embrace. But do our churches feel that way to families? And I think so many of our conversations at conferences like this, we focus on the practices and the programs that we adopt, what we do or don't do. These are really important conversations. But how do families say they feel when they're at church? Many of you are families and you could shout that out right now, I'm sure. But we asked this of 350 parents of children and youth with disabilities. We said, how do you feel when you're in church? And what we did is we gave them a list of 28 different words that came from our prior interviews and other projects with families. I'm going to read them off. You're going to notice half of those words are ones we hope to hear. The other half are perhaps the opposite. We asked parents to choose the 5 words that best captured their feelings at church. Let me read them off alphabetically, and I want you to imagine which words might come up in your church. Anxious, befriended, confident, connected, defensive, disappointed, drained, embraced, excited, excluded, frustrated, grateful or hurt, included or invisible, isolated, judged, or maybe known and loved, or maybe lonely or misunderstood. Maybe it's refreshed or relaxed, or reluctant, or seen, or supported, or unwanted, or valued. It's a lot of words that we gave. Pause for a moment and think about what you would hope to hear. What is it that you'd want families to experience in your midst? What do you think was most often felt? I'm going to share 2 different stories, one that will breaks our heart and one that will encourage us. Because here's the top 7 feelings of parents who attend church that lack any form of disability ministry, starting with the ones they most often to least often selected. Anxious, misunderstood, lonely, loved, isolated, judged, drained. Do you know what feelings were almost never named? Excited, confident, relaxed, refreshed. And maybe this is part of what leads to leaving. What are we doing or not doing that evokes these emotions? What do we do better or differently? But here's a different story. A very different portrait emerges when we focus on the families who said they're attending churches that offer intentional disability ministry, where opportunities and supports for children and their families are available and accessed. Here's the top 7 feelings that we heard from them. Grateful, supported, still anxious, loved, embraced, included, and still drained. Right? Do you know what's never named almost in this? Unwanted, hurt, defensive. And you probably noticed anxious and drained shows up on all lists, right? Being a parent is hard, being a parent of child. And so people come in with that, and it reminds us what's the care and the comfort and the love that we give, regardless of our programs, that's addressed one person at a time in relationship. Those feelings, though, of grateful and supported and loved and embraced and included were high in terms of the feelings families had. You see now clearly the 5th theme that I want to highlight, how ministry makes a difference. Ministry leaders, the efforts you are making to come to know and to serve and to love these families can be transformative. Ministry matters immensely. The ministry focused on families impacted by disability can look different from one church to the next, and it absolutely should. We asked families in this study about the ways their churches were supporting and surrounding them, and it was encouraging to hear all of the ways families talked about what their churches were doing in this area. Meeting with them about their child's support needs and involvement, hosting support groups and small groups that equip and encourage parents, connecting parents with community resources and counseling them through difficult times, offering respite care or child care, or just accompanying them in so many imaginative ways. Those are the things churches were doing that were evoking those feelings of connection and love and embrace and valuing and being seen and known and heard. If you're intrigued by what faithful ministry looks like to families, you're in the right place. This conference is all about what that might look like. Why does this area of ministry matter so much, though? What difference does it make? It actually doesn't just shape the feelings parents have. It actually impacts, your ministries impact their believing and their belonging. We talked about that a bit yesterday. We asked parents 5 questions asking about whether they as parents felt well supported in their church, whether they were developing relationships with other parents and other family members, whether they were experiencing a sense of belonging in their church, whether they were growing in their faith, and whether they enjoyed being part of their church. I want you to notice the difference between families who are in churches that were active and intentional around disability ministry and those that weren't. The number on the left, which I'll read all these out, is those that were in churches without any form of intentional supports versus those on the right that were in ones. 43% of parents agreed or strongly agreed that they were well supported at their church. It jumps to nearly 80% when their church has an established ministry. About half of parents agreed they were developing relationships with others in their church. It jumps up to 72% when we have intentional ministry in this area. 56% of parents agreed they were experiencing a sense of belonging. It jumps to 78% when churches are intentional in this area of ministry. 3/4 of parents agreed that they're growing in their faith, but it jumps up to 91% when churches have an established ministry. And 76% of families said they enjoy being part of their church. It jumps to 94% when their church has an established ministry. Those are pretty striking differences. Let me pause, though, to emphasize it matters how we do ministry. Each parent attended a church that did it in widely different ways. This isn't recipe work. Remember that what we offer and how we offer it and how well we do it makes the difference. All ministries are not the same, but for a moment, just notice how the church stories are different depending on our intentionality around ministry. And the same was true for ministry to children and youth with disabilities, which varies widely across churches. The parents in our study shared just glowingly these ways that churches were supporting the formation and friendships of their children with disabilities through carefully crafted support plans and inclusive experiences, how they adapted activities and curricula in intentional ways, the ways they thought about buddy systems and sensory considerations, and training and guidance for leaders and volunteers, and rethinking our expectations about the place of noise and movement and other things and how we worship and gather. They talked about the power of ministry to their children as well, and it shows up in the data too. These data points are where parents talked about their kids with disabilities. Only a third of parents agreed or strongly agreed that their child well supported at churches without intentional ministries. It jumped up to 81% when they're at churches that are intentional. Half of parents agreed or strongly agreed that their child, or 37% agreed or strongly agreed their child's developing relationships. How can that be? Only a third saying that. It nearly doubles when churches are intentional about this. Still room for growth. Half of parents agreed that their child feels a sense of belonging. It jumps extraordinarily up to 79% when churches are intentional. Less than half of parents agreed their child is growing in their faith in their church. But more intentional about disability and ministry, it jumps to 80%. And finally, 2/3 of families said, my child enjoys church. And again, in every single area, it's higher when we're intentional about this. Don't get lost in the numbers. Don't go back and report the statistics per se. That's not really the important part. We're looking for broad patterns here across the individual stories. The thing is this, believing and belonging can abound when we anticipate and we embrace families impacted by disability. And yet, we want those numbers to be 100%, don't we? There's more to do, even in the areas that we're intentional. So ministry leaders, can you speak to the impact of your ministry on families? Do believing and belonging abound for your families? How about supports and relationships? Is Sunday morning the best day of the week for the children with disabilities in their midst? And what is it that tells you that might be the case? And theme 6, parents still hope for more. It's become our practice to close out almost all of our studies with what we call the one wish question. Whether it's a survey or an interview, we do this with pastors, children ministry leaders, individuals. You can hear more about that in one of our sessions tomorrow. But we also ask families to share their one wish for their church or for the capital C church. We listen to some of the hopes that families hold for their churches. And I'm going to, again, stick with 7. There are so many more of these wishes we could speak to. And not all parents held the same wish. But parents long for their children with disabilities to be fully included in the life of their church, in worship services, in Sunday school classes, in summer camps, in youth programs, and friendships. Not sidelined, not tucked away, but woven in. They want their children to be loved and embraced for who they are, as beautiful and beloved, as called by name, as very good, as bearers of the image of God, as fearfully and wonderfully made. And they long for church staff and volunteers to be equipped with the postures and practical skills and deep knowledge needed to support their children with disabilities. Churches don't have to have it all figured out, but also parents expect much more movement beyond just good intentions. They hope for more. And families also wish for support for themselves and their siblings too, through respite opportunities and support groups, through friendship, through spiritual nourishment, through spaces in which their entire family can grow in faith together without isolation and without exhaustion. And they wish for Bible studies and classes and activities that match their children's learning styles and individualized need. They talked about not just child minding, but real discipleship and creative ways to help their children learn about and come to know and encounter Jesus. And families also want churches to anticipate needs, to offer solutions before they have to advocate for help. Not one more place that they have to advocate for, but a place that's proactive, that sees disability and ministry as essential and not optional, that reaches out rather than waiting for families to ask. And they wish for a place of belonging. Families want to be present and invited and welcomed and known and supported and heard. They want to be befriended and needed and loved. To have that deep assurance of belonging, and such belonging in the family of God isn't earned through achievement or ability or accomplishment. It's a gift that should be abundant in every church. which takes us to the final theme, which follows from all the others. The church should shine. And so many of your churches are shining. You're looking for ways to widen your welcome, to forge new friendships, to revisit where and how you gather. Wellspring Church meets with each new family to ask what they can do to make Sunday the best day of the week for their children with disabilities. Central Methodist makes sure that every youth with disabilities is supported to serve somewhere in the congregation. St. James budgets to send every one of their families to family camp annually every summer. It's hard-lined in the budget. St. Anne's, they send a team from their church to every one of their family's children's IEP meetings at the public school to show their support. Yeah. I've never heard applause for going to an IEP meeting. I gotta say, that's about it. First Baptist started a quarterly respite night to serve families in their community. Second Baptist, not to be outdone, launched a bigger respite ministry monthly. But they joined forces eventually and started doing it together. Riverside Methodist found a new location for their youth retreats because the old one wasn't accessible and they couldn't imagine going anywhere without Ethan. And Creekside Fellowship reimagined their worshiping and how they worshiped because they didn't want a fifth of their community to not be able to be part of the body. Examples go on and on and on, and examples abound in this room. You are each changing the church stories of families in your midst. You're moving those stories from themes of wounding to welcoming, from themes of hurt to healing, from themes of barriers to belonging, from exclusion to embrace. And I have a hunch that the stories of families are changing the stories of your churches, that they're helping you become a community that sees every person as indispensable, that they're teaching you new ways of worshiping and learning and serving and growing, and helping you encounter the love and care of God more deeply and in new ways. It's a reciprocity here. As we welcome well, we're changed in that process. That's just a snapshot of what we're learning about the state of the church through the stories of families. We know their faith matters immensely, and they long for a life of faith for their children, but they drift from their churches because church can be so hard. We know our ministry matters immensely, and yet parents long for more and hope for more, and we know our churches are called to shine, and more are. What are you learning from the stories in your midst? Where's God leading you towards change and towards transformation? I opened with a reference to Paul's encouragement to the Colossians. I thought that would be a good way to close by turning that passage into a sort of benediction for all of you. So here it is. Press forward, beloved leaders, knowing that you are held in constant prayer. May you be filled with the knowledge of God's will, guided by spiritual wisdom and deep understanding. And as you pursue this called to area of ministry, may your work bear good and lasting fruit. May your heart grow deeper, ever deeper in the knowledge of God. And may you be strengthened by the Spirit so that endurance and patience rises up within you, that joy becomes your steady companion. And as you serve, remember this, it's God and not the world who has already qualified you and each family you welcome to share in this great inheritance of the saints in light. So move forward in peace and with courage and holding joy, for the one who calls you is faithful. Amen.